The stench of death lingered thick in the air that grim morning in Charleston, South Carolina. It was March 15, 1847, and the Whitmore plantation house sat in unnerving silence. Inside the grand dining room, 3 lifeless bodies rested over their untouched breakfast plates. Master Thomas Whitmore, his wife Elenina, and their eldest son James, all gone. The only sound breaking the silence was the soft clatter of silverware as a young black woman methodically cleared the table, her face an unreadable mask. Her name was Hannah Morrison, and with nothing more than a few oleander leaves and unwavering precision, she had altered the trajectory of American history. But how did a cook, bound by slavery, become one of the most feared resistance figures in the antebellum South? How did a woman deprived of education ignite a revolution that sent terror rippling through slaveholding states? Before we delve into this remarkable tale, hit the subscribe button, like this video, and share your thoughts on the courage of enslaved resistors in America. It helps this story reach others. To grasp Hannah's legacy, we must first understand Charleston in the 1840s, a city pulsing at the core of the American slave trade. Ships from Africa docked weekly, unloading human cargo to be auctioned at the old slave mart on Chalmers Street. The cobblestone streets rang with the echoes of chains and despair, even as plantation elites like Thomas Whitmore amassed wealth upon their suffering. Charleston was a city of brutal contradictions. Majestic mansions along the Battery gazed over the harbor, while just behind them, enslaved families crowded into ramshackle quarters. The entire economy thrived on bondage, from the rice fields along the Ashley River to the inland cotton farms near Columbia. Hannah Morrison entered the world in 1820 on the Whitmore plantation, nestled 15 miles northwest of Charleston beside the Ashley River. Her mother, Celia, served as the head cook in the main house, a position of both influence and peril. Head cooks were the keepers of secrets, responsible for every dish and privy to every whisper within the walls, yet they bore the brunt of their master's wrath when anything displeased them. Hannah's father was never acknowledged, though everyone knew it was Thomas Whitmore himself. This made Hannah what they cruelly termed a house slave, light enough to work indoors but never light enough to escape bondage. Her mixed lineage became both her shield and her torment. Even as a child, she displayed an intelligence that both inspired awe and stirred unease among others. While her peers played outside the slave quarters, Hannah lingered quietly nearby, absorbing conversations never meant for her ears. Her memory was near photographic. She could repeat entire exchanges days later, never forgetting a face, a word, or an insult. Celia recognized her daughter's rare gift early on. "Child," she would whisper while they worked side by side, "your mind's sharper than any blade in this house. But sharp things cut both ways. Use it wrong and it'll destroy you. Use it right and maybe it'll destroy them." The Whitmore kitchen was Hannah's first schoolhouse. Built separately from the main home to prevent fires, it was a universe unto itself. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, hung with iron hooks and intricate cranes for maneuvering heavy pots. Shelves brimmed with jars of spices, herbs, and preserves, while the central wooden table bore deep scars from decades of chopping and grinding. It was there that Celia taught her daughter not just the art of cooking, but the art of survival. "Every plant's got a purpose," Celia would murmur, her hands steady over the mortar and pestle. "Some heal, some harm, some kill. A cook who knows her plants holds more power than any man with a whip." Hannah learned to recognize every plant on the plantation: willow bark to ease pain, foxglove to slow a racing heart, castor beans to induce sickness. But most crucial of all was oleander, the beautiful shrub that grew freely across South Carolina, deadly in every petal and leaf, yet undetectable when blended skillfully in food. "Why you teach me this, Mama?" 12-year-old Hannah once asked, watching her separate poisonous plants from harmless ones. Celia's eyes drifted toward the main house, where Master Whitmore's shouting echoed through the walls. "Because knowledge is the one thing they can't steal, child. They can sell you, beat you, break you, but they can't take what's in your head, and sometimes that's your only weapon." Hannah's youth was marked by the relentless cruelty of enslavement. She witnessed friends torn from their families, men whipped until they bled, women violated without consequence, and children collapsing from exhaustion. But it was one brutal day when she was 14 that would forever change her. On a stifling August morning in 1834, her 10-year-old brother Moses was caught stealing a peach from the orchard. Starving after days without food, His small act of desperation would cost him dearly. Thomas Whitmore decided to make an example. He summoned all the slaves to the courtyard to watch. Hannah's body trembled as her brother was bound to the whipping post. The first lash ripped his shirt. The second drew blood. By the fifth, his cries went silent. "Please, master," Celia screamed, breaking rank. "He's just a child." "He's hungry." Whitmore turned, eyes as cold as iron. "Hungry? Let's give him something to remember it by." He nodded to the overseer. 20 lashes later, Moses hung limp, his body broken. Hannah counted every strike, 20 lashes for one stolen peach. When it ended, she helped her mother carry him to their cabin. He lived, but the light in him never returned. That night, as Hannah pressed cool cloths to his wounds, something inside her shifted. Fear melted into something sharper. A cold, deliberate hatred that would burn quietly for years to come. "Mama," she whispered into the darkness, "teach me more about those plants. All of them." From then on, Hannah's education took a darker turn. During her daily herb-gathering walks, she began collecting other specimens too. She learned how moonflower seeds brought hallucinations, how pokeweed berries could suffocate, how deathcap mushrooms mimicked edible ones yet destroyed the liver within days. She experimented first on rats, then on dying chickens. She studied doses, timing, symptoms, mastering how to make death appear natural. A skilled poisoner, she realized, was one who left no trace. By 16, she was her mother's chief assistant, preparing breakfast and lunch while Celia oversaw dinner. That role gave her access to every corner of the house and insight into every family habit. She knew Thomas Whitmore took his coffee black with 2 spoons of sugar each morning at 7 sharp. She knew Elenina preferred tea with honey and toast with marmalade. She knew James liked his eggs over easy and bacon crisp. Hannah memorized their schedules, their preferences, and their weaknesses. But Hannah's world extended beyond the Whitmore estate. She nurtured quiet connections with slaves from neighboring plantations. Information traveled through a hidden network. Field hands crossing properties, house slaves accompanying masters to social events, free black artisans moving between Charleston streets, all carrying whispers and warnings. Through this underground communication, Hannah learned that her suffering was shared across countless plantations. She heard of masters who worked people to death, families sold apart without mercy, women assaulted, children starved. Yet she also heard murmurs of defiance. Slaves escaping through the Underground Railroad, work slowdowns sabotaging harvests, and house slaves enacting justice in silence. One day, an elderly field hand named Samuel told her of Martha, a cook in Virginia whose master beat slaves with a red-hot poker. One day, he said, she put something special in his stew. Doctor called it heart failure, but Martha knew better. Hannah asked what became of her. Samuel smiled faintly. "Nothing. Nobody suspects the cook. His brother took over. Treated folks kinder. Sometimes the Lord works quiet." Those stories planted something inside Hannah. She began noticing a pattern. Masters who died mysteriously were often the cruelest. Their deaths, chalked up to natural causes, were perhaps the silent work of those they'd oppressed. By 1840, Hannah Morrison had become indispensable in the Whitmore household. At 20, she was intelligent, striking, and nearly invisible to those who owned her. They spoke freely before her of politics, business, and secrets, never realizing that she was listening, remembering, and waiting. She discovered that Thomas Whitmore was deeply indebted to Charleston banks, that the plantation teetered on the brink financially, and that he was seriously considering selling off several slave families to cover his obligations. She found out James Whitmore intended to wed a young woman from Savannah, whose father possessed 3 plantations, a marriage that would elevate the Whitmores into one of South Carolina's wealthiest clans. Most horrifying of all were their plans for the enslaved people on the estate. At a dinner in late 1840, Hannah overheard Thomas tell his guests he intended to breed his slaves more deliberately, treating them as stock to boost profits. "Selective breeding is the key," he declared, his voice rising. "Keep the strong males, sell the weak, force the women to mate with the best specimens. In 10 years, I'll have the finest slave stock in the Carolinas." Hannah stood frozen in the doorway, a tray of dirty dishes balanced in her hands. He spoke as if naming animals, her friends, her family, her people reduced to livestock. She thought of her mother Celia, now 45 and crippled by years of kitchen labor. She thought of Moses, still marked by the scars from his childhood whipping. She pictured the young women in the quarters who would be coerced into Whitmore's breeding program. That night, Hannah resolved what she would do. She would not wait for freedom, hope for rescue, or pray for deliverance. She would mete out justice herself, using the only weapons she possessed: knowledge of plants, control of the food, and the invisibility her role afforded. The very next morning, Hannah began meticulous preparations. She collected oleander leaves, dried them slowly, and ground them into a fine powder that suspiciously resembled black pepper. She experimented on rats to perfect a dose that would produce a death appearing as heart failure. She studied the Whitmore family's breakfast habits with obsessive care: how much sugar Thomas put in his coffee, how Elenina stirred her tea, how James seasoned his eggs. For 6 months she plotted every detail. She could not act on impulse. One mistake would mean not only her death, but savage reprisals against every enslaved person on the plantation. She had to be flawless, patient, and utterly unseen until the moment she struck. When winter turned to spring in 1847, Hannah felt ready. Over the harsh winter months, the Whitmores had grown crueler, venting financial frustrations on those they owned. 3 field hands had perished from overwork and hunger. 2 women were sold to pay debts, torn from children and husbands. The breaking point came when Thomas Whitmore announced his plan to sell Moses to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, a thinly veiled death sentence. On the night of March 14, 1847, Hannah lay awake in her small room behind the kitchen, listening to the plantation sounds. Tomorrow would be the day. Tomorrow she would serve breakfast for the last time. Tomorrow the Whitmore family would pay for 13 years of cruelty with their lives. As dawn broke over Charleston Harbor, Hannah rose and set about making what would become the most infamous breakfast in South Carolina history. That morning at the Whitmore estate began like any other, but Hannah Morrison knew it would be the last ordinary day she would live. Walking through the morning mist toward the kitchen with a basket of eggs from the coup, she heard the noise that sealed the Whitmore's fate: the jangle of slave chains on the road. A slave trader's wagon was approaching, drawn by 2 weary mules. Hannah recognized the driver at once: Josiah Fletcher, one of Charleston's most notorious dealers. Fletcher specialized in buying enslaved people from cash-strapped plantations and reselling them to the brutal Louisiana sugar camps, where life expectancy averaged less than 7 years. Thomas Whitmore emerged from the main house, already dressed and expecting Fletcher. Hannah slipped behind the kitchen and listened as the 2 men did business. "I can pay $800 for the boy," Fletcher said, spitting tobacco in the dirt. "He's got the size the sugar masters like. Won't last long, but they'll get good work out of him." "800 seems fair," Whitmore replied. "He's been trouble. Maybe Louisiana will teach him respect." Hannah felt her world tilt. Moses, her baby brother, still fragile from that childhood beating, was being sold to a living grave, discussed like an animal. Fletcher continued, "I'll take him today. Got a ship leaving Charleston Harbor tomorrow morning. Easier when they don't have time to say goodbye. Makes them more compliant." As Hannah crouched behind the kitchen, something inside her snapped. Years of careful preparation suddenly risked being undone. Fletcher would chain Moses and carry him off before Hannah could complete her plan unless she acted now. Watching Fletcher appraise Moses like livestock, Hannah realized this had become bigger than saving her brother. It was about sending a message across every plantation in South Carolina. The house slaves had been whispering about action for years. Hannah would be the one to fire the first shot. She spent the remainder of that morning sharpening her plan with deadly detail. The Whitmores always ate breakfast together at 7 sharp. Thomas, Elenina, and James, creatures of routine who made predictable targets. More crucially, they dined in the main dining room away from the kitchen, giving Hannah several minutes between serving the food and their first bites. Timing was everything. Too much oleander and they would notice the taste. Too little, and they might survive. Hannah had spent months calculating the precise dose required for each family member based on weight and eating habits. Thomas weighed roughly 200 pounds and ate heartily. Elenina was smaller, perhaps 130 pounds, and tended to pick at her food. James was young and strong, maybe 170 pounds, and ate quickly. Hannah retrieved her oleander powder from its hiding place, a small ceramic jar buried beneath the kitchen floorboards. The powder was so fine it could be mistaken for black pepper. She had tested it thoroughly on rats to ensure it would kill yet remain undetectable. While she worked, Hannah's thoughts reached beyond poison measurements. She considered the network of house slaves across Charleston and neighboring plantations, how word would travel fast about what unfolded at the Whitmore place, and how she wanted that word to carry the right meaning. She had cultivated relationships with other house servants for years through the covert channels that linked estates. Sarah at the Middleton plantation on the Ashley River had shared accounts of her master's cruelty. Mary, a seamstress for the Pinckneys in Charleston, was learning to read in secret from her mistress's letters. Rebecca, who ran the household at a rice plantation near Georgetown, had been recording instances of sexual abuse she'd witnessed. These women formed an informal network Hannah had nurtured since she turned 18, an invisible army of house slaves who moved through white society unnoticed while gathering intelligence and staging small acts of sabotage. A batch of spoiled preserves here, a ruined garment there, unexplained accidents that cost masters time and money. But what Hannah plotted was far beyond petty mischief. She planned murder, and she needed her network to grasp its purpose. This was not random violence. It was deliberate justice. She was declaring war on behalf of every person who had been beaten, sold, violated, or killed by the plantation system. The night before, Hannah had sent coded signals through the slave communication lines. Field hands moving between properties carried her message to house servants across the Lowcountry. "The cook sends word that tomorrow's breakfast will be specially seasoned," the code read, an alert her neighbors would understand. Every house slave in the area would know the meaning. Hannah was telling them she was ready to act and that they should prepare for the aftermath. As she assembled the breakfast that would enter history, she reflected on the larger stakes. For years she had listened to the white families talk about fears, finances, and politics, learning how plantation owners across the South were already anxious about uprisings, especially since Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia 16 years earlier. What made her plan so cunning was her grasp of fear's power. Killing the Whitmores would be satisfying revenge, yes, but it would also terrorize every plantation owner nearby. It would force them to confront the reality that their most trusted servants, the ones who cooked their meals, cared for their children, and kept their secrets, could betray them at any moment. Hannah had watched how white families treated their house slaves and found their greatest weakness: trust. Thomas never questioned the food Hannah served. Eleanor never suspected her tea might be poisoned. James never imagined the young woman who tidied his room might be plotting his death. That faith was born of racist assumptions, that enslaved people were naturally submissive and incapable of planning sophisticated resistance. Hannah intended to destroy that illusion once and for all. If this story has captivated you, remember to like the video and share in the comments what decision you might have made in her place. Subscribe for more moving stories of endurance and rebellion. The psychological design of Hannah's scheme was as intricate as the poison she prepared. She had spent years carefully observing how the Whitmore family responded to tension and hardship. Thomas turned violent whenever his authority was questioned. Eleanor preferred to retreat into denial rather than confront harsh truths. James depended entirely on his father's dominance to fix any problem. None of them were mentally or emotionally ready to face the total dismantling of their control. More significantly, other plantation owners in the region would have to face the terrifying realization that their power could collapse even within their own homes. Hannah was also fully aware of the legal consequences of her plot. The South Carolina statutes of 1847 were explicit. Any enslaved person who took the life of a white individual would face execution, almost always by public hanging. Yet Hannah had studied numerous cases of mysterious master deaths and recognized that discreet house slaves often avoided blame. The secret lay in making the deaths appear natural. Oleander poisoning mirrored the symptoms of a fatal heart condition: chest pain, labored breathing, and sudden cardiac failure. In an age without modern forensics, proving poisoning was almost impossible, particularly when the victims already suffered from visible ailments. Thomas Whitmore had been complaining of heart discomfort for months, blaming financial strain. Eleanor often fainted and described herself as weak with nervous fits. James had taken to heavy drinking and put on considerable weight. Each of them had credible health explanations for a sudden collapse. Her meticulous plan also accounted for the aftermath. Hannah knew suspicion would first fall upon the field workers, those who already carried reputations for rebellion. White authorities would assume defiance came from the fields, not from the obedient servants inside their homes. This gave Hannah several strategic advantages. First, she would be above immediate suspicion. Second, Her trusted role in the household would allow her to subtly influence the story that spread among the white community. And third, she could divert attention away from innocent slaves, protecting them from the brutal reprisals that were sure to follow. But her ambitions extended far beyond escaping justice. Hannah sought to ignite an uprising, one that required more than a single act of vengeance. To succeed, she needed to inspire others to act, while concealing the wider movement from the white elite. Her answer was simple yet ingenious. Make her deed appear isolated while encoding its true meaning for those who would understand. The plantation owners would dismiss it as an unfortunate coincidence, but her people would recognize it as the first declaration of war. To make this possible, Hannah relied on her elaborate system of secret communication. The coded phrases she had used for years would now carry new weight. Messages such as the cook's new recipe or breakfast was especially satisfying would tell other enslaved workers that poisoning could be an effective act of defiance. In quiet conversations and visits to nearby estates, Hannah had also begun passing on her knowledge of toxic plants. She taught others about oleander, foxglove, castor beans, and other lethal flora common across South Carolina, disguising her lessons as warnings to protect their families from dangerous herbs. The cleverest of her listeners understood the double meaning. The same plants that could heal could also destroy. This knowledge, when used wisely, could become a weapon against oppression. She had also kept mental records of the region's cruelest masters, those whose brutality demanded reckoning. In her mind, she maintained a list of at least 12 slaveholders notorious for their depravity, including several who had assaulted women and one who had worked multiple slaves to death in a single year. These men were marked as future targets should her plan succeed. Hannah had already begun discreetly exchanging details about their habits, diets, and weaknesses with trusted servants in their households. As the sun climbed on March 15, 1847, Hannah completed her final preparations. She measured precise amounts of oleander powder for each member of the Whitmore family, double-checking every calculation. She reviewed the daily schedule once more, ensuring she'd have a window of privacy to tamper with the food. Most importantly, she steeled herself for the gravity of what she was about to do. Though she had never taken a life before, she had spent years readying herself for this very moment. Her mind returned to Moses, who would soon be sold to his death if she didn't act. She thought of her mother, Celia, whose swollen joints ached from a lifetime of cooking. She remembered every beating, every separation, every murder committed under that roof. But she also saw the future her act could create, a wave of defiance spreading through the Low Country. Some would take similar action, others would rebel quietly, and a few would flee altogether. The war she was beginning would not rely on blades or bullets, but on cunning, secrecy, and resolve. It would be fought by those the masters trusted most, the ones hiding in plain sight. Hannah kindled the fire in the kitchen hearth, preparing what would become South Carolina's most infamous breakfast. She whispered a prayer to her ancestors, those who had survived the crossing, endured bondage, and preserved the wisdom now guiding her hands. The era of waiting had ended. The hour of reckoning had come. Hannah Morrison, the unseen servant who had long fed her oppressors, was about to serve them their final meal. The morning of March 15, 1847, dawned heavy and humid over the Whitmore plantation. Spanish moss hung from the oaks like mourning veils, and a dense fog crept in from Charleston Harbor, muting every sound as if nature itself anticipated the day's grim events. Hannah awoke before dawn as she always did, but today her movements were calm and certain. She dressed in her coarse cotton gown and tied the faded blue headscarf that had once belonged to her mother. No trace of fear lingered within her, only a quiet, focused resolve. At 5:30, she crossed the misty courtyard barefoot, the iron keys at her waist clinking softly. Those keys granted her command over every cupboard, every spice jar, every ingredient that would play its part in today's dark ritual. The kitchen was her arena, her altar, her weapon. She lit the great hearth with the confidence of ritual practice. The orange glow danced across the whitewashed walls as she filled an iron pot with well water and set it to boil. Each movement was deliberate, sacred, echoing generations of women who had labored before her. From beneath a loose floorboard, she retrieved the small ceramic jar that contained the oleander powder. It appeared harmless, fine and pale, almost like ground pepper, but Hannah knew its deadly potential. Within that powder lay the force to strike terror into every slaveholder in the South. Her calculations were exact. Thomas, weighing about 200 pounds, would require 2 teaspoons mixed into his coffee. Elena, lighter and frail, would receive 1 teaspoon in her tea. James, younger and stronger, would be given 1.5 teaspoons over his breakfast. Timing would determine everything. The Whitmores were creatures of habit. Thomas appeared promptly at 7 for coffee and the morning paper. Elena followed at 7:15, and James dragged himself down at 7:30, hungover and irritable, demanding food before heading to the fields. Hannah began her deadly dance with practiced grace. She ground the coffee beans, letting the familiar aroma fill the air, a comforting disguise for death. She sliced thick bread, arranged it neatly on the silver tray, and cracked the eggs into a bright ceramic bowl. The golden yolks gleamed under the firelight like the rising sun the Whitmores would never see again. At 7:15, she heard Thomas's steady steps echo across the floorboards of the main house. Ever punctual, ever proud of his discipline, this morning that discipline would seal his fate. Calmly, Hannah poured boiling water over the coffee grounds, stirring until it reached the perfect strength. With quiet precision, she added 2 spoons of sugar, just as he preferred, followed by the fatal 2 teaspoons of oleander powder. It dissolved instantly, leaving no taste, no scent, no trace. Thomas Whitmore would drink his death without suspicion. Next came Elena's tea. From the locked cabinet, Hannah selected the finest ceylon leaves her mistress adored, an imported luxury enjoyed while her slaves starved. She measured the leaves into the delicate porcelain teapot that had belonged to Elena's grandmother, letting the boiling water turn them into a rich amber brew. With a faint, ironic smile, Hannah sweetened the tea with 2 spoonfuls of honey brought from Savannah. Then, with the same steady hand that had prepared thousands of innocent meals, she stirred in a single teaspoon of oleander powder. The sweetness of the honey concealed any trace of texture that might have exposed the poison's presence. As the clock on the kitchen mantel chimed 7 times, Hannah heard the creak of Thomas Whitmore's study door opening. He was arriving for his morning coffee, exactly as he had done every day for the past 10 years. She placed his cup neatly on a silver tray beside the day's issue of the Charleston Mercury, which featured headlines about Congress debating the expansion of slavery into new territories. How fitting, Hannah thought, that Thomas would read of slavery's future while unknowingly sipping the drink that would end his own. She carried the tray toward the main house with her usual calm, deliberate pace. Nothing hurried, nothing suspicious. Every detail of normalcy mattered. Thomas was already seated at his grand mahogany desk when Hannah entered, his gray hair slicked with pomade and his expression that of a man convinced the world existed solely for his pleasure. "Good morning, Hannah," he said without glancing up. "Weather's clearing up nicely, should be perfect for planting." "Yes, master," Hannah answered softly, her tone smooth and unreadable as she placed the cup by his right hand. Perfect weather indeed. Thomas lifted the cup and took his first sip at precisely 7:03. Hannah's gaze remained fixed on her work as he drank deeply and sighed in contentment. The oleander was already threading through his veins, beginning its silent assault on his heart. Without hesitation, she turned back to the kitchen to prepare Elena's breakfast. The mistress of the house always preferred her morning meal in the sunroom that overlooked her treasured rose garden. Elena liked to imagine herself a fragile southern belle, though at 43 she was as hard and unbending as the iron tools her slaves used in the fields. The tea service was a daily ceremony. Fine china, silver spoons, folded linen napkins, and fresh flowers freshly cut from the garden. Hannah assembled each piece with careful precision, aware that her mistress's sharp eyes would notice even the smallest imperfection. The poisoned tea sat innocently in its porcelain pot, indistinguishable from the countless others Hannah had prepared over the years. At exactly 7:15, she tapped lightly on the sunroom door. Elena was already seated, wrapped in a pale yellow silk gown, her graying hair arranged in an elaborate style her maid had spent an hour crafting. "You're perfectly on time, Hannah," Elena said with the smug tone of someone who measured their worth through control. "Pour the tea, please. Make sure it isn't too strong. I'm feeling fragile this morning." Hannah poured the tea with the same steady grace that had served her well for 7 long years. The golden liquid streamed into the delicate cup, a wisp of steam curling like incense from its surface. Elena added her usual splash of cream and stirred with her heirloom silver spoon. Perfect temperature, she murmured after her first sip, taken precisely at 7:18. You make the most delightful tea, Hannah. I truly don't know what I'd do without you. If this story is captivating you, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts about the heroine's choice. Subscribe for more tales of courage and resistance. Hannah bowed slightly. Thank you, ma'am. Shall I bring anything else? No, dear. Just let James know his breakfast is ready when he comes down. You know how impatient he gets. Hannah returned to the kitchen for the last stage of her plan. James Whitmore, the youngest and most vicious of the family, was 24, a man who treated enslaved women as toys and the men as targets for his cruelty. It was his casual laughter that had sealed Moses's fate, mocking that the boy would learn obedience in the sugar fields of Louisiana. James preferred his eggs over easy, his bacon crisp and his grits drowning in butter. Hannah prepared his plate exactly to his liking, then dusted oleander powder lightly over the eggs and stirred it into the grits until no trace remained. The toxin blended invisibly into the yellow and cream tones of the meal, and James, known for his impatience, never ate slowly enough to notice a difference. At 7:32, he stumbled into the dining room, hair unkempt, clothes wrinkled from another night of heavy drinking. Already irritable, he barked, "Where's my food, Hannah? I told you I've got to be in the fields early today. Those useless hands need constant watching." Without a word, Hannah placed his plate before him. He began devouring the meal at once, chewing noisily, swallowing between curses, eating like a man who had never known hunger. He consumed the poisoned eggs in 4 large bites, followed by the tainted grits, washing it all down with milk Hannah had intentionally left pure. She wanted him to taste every morsel of his destruction. By 7:45, all 3 members of the Whitmore family had eaten their fatal breakfast. Hannah returned to her duties, washing dishes and tidying the kitchen, her expression calm and unremarkable, as she awaited the poison's inevitable effects. The first symptoms surfaced within 20 minutes. From the study, Hannah heard Thomas's voice, first a faint groan, then a more urgent call for his wife. By 8:15, both parents were gathered in the dining room, pale and unsteady. Thomas clutched his chest, gasping, while Elena complained of dizziness and nausea. "Must be something in the air," Thomas muttered, loosening his collar, sweat collecting on his forehead. "This damn humidity always wrecks my breathing." James rose from the table to leave, but immediately sat again, confusion flashing in his eyes. "I feel strange," he muttered, his words slurring. "Like I can't get enough air." Hannah continued wiping the counters, listening as confusion gave way to alarm. Elena's eyes darted toward her husband. "Thomas, your face, it's gray," she stammered weakly. "And James, he looks awful. We should send for Dr. Morrison." Her voice trembled as her own body began to fail, heart racing wildly as her blood pressure dropped. Thomas attempted to stand but fell back into his chair, pain radiating down his arm. "Can't breathe," he rasped, panic finally cracking his composure. James tried to speak but managed only a strangled sound, his body already surrendering to the toxin. By 8:30, the oleander had claimed complete command of their systems. Their hearts stuttered, their breathing came in shallow bursts, and the once quiet dining room filled with the desperate sounds of dying. Hannah appeared in the doorway, her face an impeccable mask of alarm. "Master Mistress, is everything all right?" I heard shouting. Thomas tried to gesture toward the kitchen, suspicion flickering too late. "Something in the food," he tried to say, but his strength failed him. Oleander left no taste, no scent, no evidence. His doubts would perish alongside him. Elena's trembling voice barely rose above a whisper. "Get help, a doctor. Something's wrong." Hannah nodded swiftly and rushed toward the quarters, pretending to send for aid. She knew well that no physician could arrive soon enough to save them, and even if one did, there was no cure for oleander poisoning in that era. When she returned moments later, breathless and claiming to have dispatched a field hand to fetch Dr. Morrison from Charleston, the scene had nearly ended. Thomas lay unconscious at the table. James was convulsing violently, and Elena was fading fast, eyes wide with dawning terror. "Hannah!" Elena gasped, reaching out with a trembling hand. "Help us, please." Hannah knelt beside her, taking the woman's frail hand in her own. Their eyes met for one brief, final moment, and in that instant, Elena understood. The realization flashed across her face. The trusted servant she had ruled over for years had orchestrated her end. Too weak to speak, Elena could only stare. her eyes a mixture of fear, betrayal, and a faint, grim acknowledgement of justice long overdue. Thomas Whitmore died first, his heart ceasing at 8:57 as he collapsed forward onto the table. James followed 5 minutes later, his youth no match for the poison's relentless work. Elena lingered, her smaller dose prolonging her agony until 9:15, when she finally exhaled her last breath, her cold hand still clasped in Hannah's. As the clock struck 9:30, Hannah Morrison stood alone amid the lifeless bodies of her former masters. The mighty Whitmore family, once feared across their corner of South Carolina, now lay silent in the wreckage of their own cruelty. She felt no triumph, no joy, only the heavy certainty that justice had at last been done. The dynasty that had thrived on human suffering had met its reckoning. And beyond those walls, a new message was already taking root across the South. The war had begun, not with guns or fire, but with intelligence, patience, and poison. The age of untouchable masters was finished, ended by a single breakfast that history would never forget. The silence that followed Elena Whitmore's final breath was overwhelming. For 7 long years, Hannah Morrison had lived in a world filled with the sounds of bondage, commands shouted in anger, the sharp crack of whips, the metallic clatter of chains. Now, as she stood in the dining room surrounded by the lifeless bodies of her former masters, the stillness felt unnatural, like the breathless calm between lightning and thunder. Moving with deliberate composure, Hannah's mind raced through the dozen careful steps that would decide whether she survived the day. Years of planning had led to this moment, but her true test would be navigating what came next. She needed to establish her innocence and control the story that would be told. Walking steadily to the plantation bell, she rang it 3 times, the signal for a medical emergency. The clang echoed across the fields, summoning the overseer and several field hands to the main house. Then Hannah returned to the dining room, arranging herself as a terrified servant who had stumbled upon tragedy. When Jack Morrison, the white overseer, burst through the front door with 2 field hands at his side, he found Hannah kneeling by Elena's chair, attempting to revive her with smelling salts from the medicine cabinet. "Lord have mercy," Jack gasped, staring at the 3 bodies around the breakfast table. "What in God's name happened here, Hannah?" She looked up with tears streaming down her cheeks, tears that were real, though not for the reasons he believed. She wept for Moses, still chained in the trader's wagon on his way to Louisiana, for her mother, Celia, whose aching hands had prepared countless meals for those who saw her as less than human, for every soul crushed under the Whitmore's cruelty. But to Jack, she looked like a heartbroken slave mourning her masters. "I don't know, Master Jack," she sobbed. "I served their breakfast as always and went to tend the garden. When I came back to clear the dishes, I found them like this." Master Thomas was clutching his chest, and Miss Eleanor was calling for help. But by the time I reached her, her voice broke in perfect imitation of despair. Jack knelt beside Thomas's body, searching for a pulse that wasn't there. "Must have been his heart," he muttered. "Man's been complaining about chest pains for months. Those money troubles been eating at him." Exactly what Hannah had counted on. Thomas's heart issues provided the perfect cover for oleander poisoning, which mimicked cardiac arrest flawlessly. "But what about Miss Elena and young Master James?" asked Samuel, one of the field hands gathered by the doorway. "They both healthy as horses." Jack stood, running a hand through his hair, struggling to explain what he saw. "Sometimes these things run in families. Weak hearts, bad bloodlines, or maybe something they ate. Food poisoning can kill fast if it's bad enough." Hannah nearly smiled. He was, without realizing it, speaking the truth. It had been something they ate, and it had killed them swiftly. But he would never guess that the killer was kneeling before him. "Samuel, ride to Charleston and fetch Dr. Morrison," Jack ordered. "Hannah, you stay put and keep watch. Don't let anyone in here till the doctor comes." As the men rushed to carry out his commands, Hannah found herself alone again with the bodies. This was the moment she had spent years preparing for. The fragile hours when her behavior would determine whether she would be viewed as a loyal servant or a suspect. Moving efficiently, she began cleaning the breakfast dishes, removing every trace of the oleander that had sealed their fate. The pewter coffee pot was polished until it gleamed. The porcelain teacup was washed and dried with surgical care. The plates that had held James's meal were scrubbed spotless. No trace of the deadly residue remained. But Hannah's most crucial task was shaping the story that would follow. She had spent years building quiet alliances among the house slaves of Charleston, and now that network would serve its purpose. While waiting for Dr. Morrison to arrive, Hannah sent out coded messages through trusted field hands who moved between plantations. The language was crafted to seem harmless to white ears but carried hidden meaning to those who understood. To Sarah, the cook at the Middleton plantation, she wrote, "Breakfast didn't agree with the family today. They all took sick after eating. Thought you should know in case there's something bad going around." To Mary, the seamstress at the Pinckney estate, "Lost the whole family this morning. Hearts gave out one by one, strangest thing you ever saw." And to Rebecca, who managed households near Georgetown, "The master's coffee was too strong today. No more breakfast service needed here." Each message, layered with secret intent, would be read as innocent gossip by white eyes but understood by their true recipients as something far more significant. With those words, Hannah secured her cover story, warned her allies, and announced that the quiet revolution she had long prepared for had begun. Dr. Morrison arrived from Charleston at 2 that afternoon, an elderly man with a gentle manner who had tended the Whitmores for over a decade. From the kitchen, Hannah watched him examine each body in turn, noting his measured calm as he searched for signs of illness or trauma. When he finally spoke, his conclusion was exactly what she had anticipated. "Appears to be cardiac failure," he told Jack. Thomas had complained of chest pains for months. The stress of his finances must have been too much, and sometimes when one family member dies suddenly, it triggers shock in the rest, especially if there's a hereditary weakness of the heart. Jack nodded solemnly. "So you don't think it was poisoning? Nothing bad in the food?" Dr. Morrison shook his head. "No indication of that. No discoloration, no foaming, no convulsions or vomiting. It all looks natural. Tragic, but natural." Hannah continued to quietly polish the silverware, her expression fixed in perfect sorrow as she listened. The doctor's diagnosis sealed her safety. There would be no investigation, no suspicion, no testing of the dishes she had already scrubbed clean. By evening, word of the Whitmore tragedy had swept through Charleston like wildfire. The plantation was soon filled with relatives, neighbors, and curious visitors, all eager to pay respects and speculate about the sudden deaths. Hannah drifted through the crowded rooms like a silent shadow, serving drinks and food, her ears tuned to every conversation. The white guests murmured their disbelief. No one suspected foul play. They blamed stress, fragile health, and cruel coincidence. They spoke of Thomas's financial troubles, Ilila Nena's delicate nature, and the heartbreaking loss of a young man in his prime. But Hannah paid closest attention to what they said about the estate's future. Thomas Whitmore had died deep in debt, and his property, including every enslaved person, would be sold to pay the creditors. Moses, she realized, would still be sent to the sugar fields of Louisiana, along with most of the others. But Hannah had already prepared for this outcome. Among the mourners was Elizabeth Whitmore, Thomas's unmarried sister from Charleston, a woman known for her moral objections to slavery. She had inherited enough money to purchase several of the estate's slaves, and Hannah had spent months earning her trust. During the funeral arrangements, Hannah approached her with quiet grace. "Miss Elizabeth, ma'am," she began softly, "I don't mean to trouble you in your sorrow, but I'm fearful for what'll happen to my family when the plantation's sold." Elizabeth, a kind-faced woman in her 50s who sympathized with abolitionists, looked at Hannah with pity. "Oh, my dear, I can only imagine how frightening this must be. I've been thinking about that very thing." Hannah nodded, lowering her eyes. "My Mama Celia's hands are twisted bad with the arthritis, ma'am," she said gently, her tone perfectly measured. "And my little brother Moses, he's too weak for the brutal work on the sugar plantations. I prayed you might consider purchasing us when the estate is settled." Elizabeth had been intending to make precisely that offer. She had watched Hannah's devotion to the Whitmore family for years and admired her sharp mind and steady composure. More importantly, Elizabeth longed to act on her anti-slavery beliefs without completely defying Charleston's social order. "I think that can be arranged," Elizabeth said softly. "I'll speak with the estate lawyers about buying you, your mother, and your brother. I can't purchase everyone, but I can save your family." This moment marked the peak of Hannah's long-planned manipulation. She had carefully analyzed Elizabeth's personality, recognized her moral struggle with slavery, and positioned herself as the perfect answer to Elizabeth's need to help without appearing rebellious. Elizabeth believed she was performing a Christian act of mercy, but in truth, she was being drawn into Hannah's network of resistance. The Whitmore family's funeral took place 3 days later at St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Charleston. Nearly half the city's elite attended. Hannah stood quietly at the back among the other slaves, head bowed in false mourning, while the minister spoke of Thomas Whitmore as a pious man who had treated his slaves with Christian virtue. The hypocrisy was staggering, yet Hannah endured it. Knowing a truth no one else in the church could imagine, she had avenged countless lives destroyed by this family's cruelty, and their deaths would inspire others to follow her path. In the following weeks, as the estate was divided and its slaves auctioned to new owners, Hannah began hearing whispers that confirmed her plan was unfolding perfectly. Across Charleston, house slaves were murmuring about the sudden Whitmore deaths. Officially, heart failure was blamed, but among the enslaved, the truth carried through coded language and rumor. The messages Hannah had sent immediately after the killings were being dissected by house slaves who understood their secret meanings. Sarah, the Middleton plantation cook, began experimenting with natural remedies that could make overseers fall ill. Mary in Charleston taught fellow servants how to recognize toxic plants during market trips. Rebecca, near Georgetown, kept careful records of cruel masters' daily habits, information that could serve future acts of vengeance. Most importantly, fear began spreading among white planters. Owners throughout the Low Country grew uneasy, realizing that the people who cooked their food and knew their most private routines might now be their greatest threat. Some demanded that slaves taste meals before serving. Others changed their schedules daily to be less predictable. A few paranoid masters even insisted on cooking their own food. This anxiety was exactly what Hannah had aimed for. For the first time, house slaves were no longer seen as harmless attendants but as potential enemies. The psychological war Hannah had ignited was well underway. If this story moved you, subscribe, like, and comment. Which part struck you most deeply? Your support helps keep these hidden histories alive and inspires new stories of defiance and courage. 3 months after the Whitmore family's deaths, Hannah had established a new life as Elizabeth Whitmore's house servant in Charleston. Her mother Celia worked as the cook, her joints easing with better meals and lighter labor, while Moses served as a general helper, spared from the deadly sugar fields. But Hannah's true mission was only beginning. Her new home in Charleston connected her to a vast network of enslaved workers, and she used that access to spread her teachings and philosophy. During Sunday gatherings at the African Methodist Episcopal Church, she educated others about medicinal and poisonous plants, showing how to craft substances that could harm without revealing their origins. More importantly, she taught discipline, foresight, and the art of psychological warfare, how patience could achieve what open rebellion could not. Her influence spread beyond Charleston, carried through the vast communication lines that linked enslaved communities across the South. Stories of the Whitmore deaths reached servants in Virginia, Georgia, and Alabama. By 1850, rumors of mysterious deaths among plantation owners were becoming common. A cruel Virginia master collapsing after breakfast, a Georgia overseer dying from heart failure, an Alabama trader found dead beside his morning coffee. White society dismissed these as coincidences, but the enslaved recognized them as proof of a growing underground movement. Hannah's lessons had awakened a realization among house slaves. They held quiet power over life and death. This invisible uprising deeply unsettled the white South. The belief that house slaves were loyal by nature began to crumble, replaced by suspicion and fear. Paranoia spread, hardening the divide between North and South and pushing the nation closer to war. Southern planters grew defensive and isolated, while Northern abolitionists began hearing faint stories of resistance spreading through the plantations. Frederick Douglass wrote cautiously about a new spirit of defiance among the enslaved, avoiding any direct call to violence. Harriet Tubman, already leading the Underground Railroad, adapted Hannah's methods, teaching fugitives how to identify poisonous plants and defend themselves from pursuers. Hannah's legacy went far beyond poisoning. It reshaped how enslaved people resisted, from secret sabotage and work slowdowns to the preservation of African traditions that white society sought to erase. Her network evolved into a covert intelligence system, gathering and exchanging news about abolitionists, escape routes, and resistance strategies. By 1860, as America neared civil war, Hannah Morrison was legendary across the South. Her story passed in whispers, hidden in songs, and remembered through oral tales that endured beyond slavery itself. When the war began, Hannah, now 41, still served in Elizabeth Whitmore's Charleston home, but she also commanded a vast resistance web stretching through the Confederacy. As Union forces closed in on Charleston in 1863, her network supplied vital information on Confederate movements and supplies. House slaves, invisible and underestimated, became spies and messengers under her guidance. When Charleston finally surrendered in 1865, Hannah stepped out of Elizabeth Whitmore's house a free woman. Union officers, aware of her covert contributions, sought to enlist her for Reconstruction efforts, but Hannah had another mission. She spent her final years collecting testimonies from former slaves, documenting their acts of rebellion, sabotage, and survival. Hannah Morrison passed away in 1889 at age 69. Hundreds of freedmen attended her funeral, honoring the woman whose courage had sparked their own. She was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, but her legacy endured through the stories told by those she had empowered. Her influence reached into the 20th century, shaping strategies of the civil rights movement that used psychology and subversion against oppression. Modern historians now recognize the 1840s and 1850s as a crucial turning point in slave resistance, when subtle defiance replaced open revolt. Though official records rarely acknowledged poison as a weapon of rebellion, patterns of mysterious deaths among cruel masters suggest Hannah's methods inspired many. Today she is remembered as one of the most ingenious figures of American resistance, a woman who proved that intellect could be deadlier than violence, that loyalty could be a mask for revolution, and that liberation could begin in a kitchen with courage, knowledge, and a handful of deadly plants. Her story endures as a testament that resistance wears many faces, and that those deemed powerless often hold the strength to change the world. The breakfast she served on March 15, 1847, was not just a meal but a declaration of war, one that helped bring freedom to 4 million enslaved souls. Hannah Morrison, the unseen cook who rewrote history, had served her final dish, justice itself.